The sun hung low over Red Moon Ridge, casting long shadows across the cracked earth and turning the jagged canyons a deep shade of blood red. The wind stirred up dust, whispering through the dry grasses like a restless spirit. This was no place for the faint-hearted, a forgotten outpost on the edge of civilization where the law was little more than a memory, and every man and woman carved out survival in silence. Amidst the skeletal remains of weathered buildings and abandoned wagons stood the modest McAllister Ranch, its wooden fences scarred by time and neglect. Clara McAllister moved quietly along the boundary line, her hands steady as she repaired the battered fence with practiced care. The years had etched lines of sorrow into her face, but there was a resolute strength in her eyes, a flicker of fire that refused to be snuffed out. She wore a simple faded dress and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her from the harsh afternoon sun, but beneath the gentle appearance lay the heart of a woman who had endured more than most. Since her husband's death, the ranch had become her burden and her sanctuary, a place where memories lingered like ghosts in the heat. Nearby, her younger brother, Sam, tended the small garden patch, his fingers rough but careful with the tender shoots of beans and corn. He looked up when he heard the scrape of boots on dry earth, a shadow falling over the sun-baked ground. A stranger had come to Red Moon Ridge, a rare occurrence that stirred the gossip of the town like wildfire. The man was lean and weathered, his clothes coated in dust, and his eyes, sharp beneath a battered hat pulled low. Without a word, he approached Clara's fence and began to help, lifting broken boards and driving in new stakes with quiet efficiency. Clara watched him with cautious curiosity. He spoke only once, a gruff "ma'am," before falling silent again. There was something about him, an unspoken weight in the way he moved, as if the desert itself carried his secrets. In the distance, the faint clatter of hooves echoed across the ridge. The Crowder boys, a ruthless gang known for their lawlessness and bloodshed, had been spotted moving westward. They had eyes on Red Moon Ridge now, and word was spreading through the saloon and general store like a plague. They were after something valuable, a shipment meant for the marshal in the next town, and a widow's ranch stood squarely in their path. Inside the dim, smoke-filled saloon, voices lowered to nervous murmurs. The barkeep wiped down the bar with a rag that had seen better days, glancing toward the door whenever it creaked. Locals exchanged worried looks, knowing full well what the arrival of the Crowders meant. Few dared to stand against them, and fewer still had the means. But Clara was different. The stories around town whispered of her quiet resilience, though few had witnessed the full measure of her resolve. As twilight deepened, the stranger returned to the ranch, lingering just long enough to offer a nod before disappearing into the fading light. Clara stood at the edge of her porch, scanning the horizon where the sun bled into the canyons, knowing the coming days would test every ounce of her courage. Her hands rested lightly on the rifle leaned against the porch post, a relic of her past she had vowed never to wield again unless forced. Then, from the ridge above, Boone Crowder appeared, watching the ranch with eyes that bore the hard edge of a man who had spent his life breaking rules and bending fate. When his gaze settled on Clara, something inside him shifted. For a moment, the outlaw forgot the laws he'd shattered and the blood left on his hands. In the fading light, he saw not a prize or a target, but a woman whose spirit challenged the very world he knew. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant danger. Red Moon Ridge held its breath. The night was coming, and with it, a reckoning that no one could have foreseen. The dawn crept over Red Moon Ridge with a pale light that barely touched the jagged cliffs. Clara McAllister rose early, her movements deliberate and measured, like a quiet storm gathering strength. The ranch, bathed in morning mist, seemed fragile, but within its boundaries, she wielded a fierce, unyielding will. The past weeks had not dulled her senses. If anything, the shadow of the Crowder boys, hanging nearby, sharpened her every instinct. Her hands, calloused from years of hard labor, moved deftly over a worn leather holster she kept hidden beneath her skirts. Though the world saw a widow bound to grief, Clara had been raised on rifle and tracking, skills her late father had taught with stern hands and clear eyes. The gun was never far, not as a tool of vengeance, but as a shield against the lawlessness creeping ever closer. Sam joined her by the fire pit, eyes clouded with worry but trusting in his sister's strength. "You think they'll come this way?" he asked softly, voice barely above the crackle of the flames. Clara's gaze lingered on the canyon's edge. "They will. The Crowders don't leave loose ends." She paused, then added, "But they don't know who they're dealing with yet." That afternoon, the stranger returned. His name was Everett Kane, though Clara only learned that when he spoke of himself in passing. His story was etched in the scars lining his weathered face. A man who had vanished from justice's grasp long ago, now returned not just as a wanderer, but as a marshal with a vendetta. His quiet presence unsettled the town, but Clara sensed a kindred spirit beneath the worn exterior. Everett kept to himself but watched Red Moon Ridge with a keen, calculating eye. One evening, he caught Clara repairing the fence, and without fanfare, offered his help. Together, their hands worked in silence, the trust between them forming in the unspoken spaces. Clara saw in him the heavy weight of loss and duty, the same burden she bore. News came that Boone Crowder had sent scouts ahead, 2 men riding fast through the hills to size up the ranch. They arrived under the noon sun, rough and cruel, expecting to intimidate a widow into submission. Instead, they found Clara calm, her voice steady as she warned them to turn back. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet fire that made the men hesitate, their bravado faltering. They left shaken, whispering of a woman who was no easy prey. That night, Boone Crowder himself rode up the ridge, alone and unannounced. The air was thick with tension as he dismounted, his boots stirring the dust near Clara's porch. He looked at her not as a foe, but as something more complicated, an enigma wrapped in defiance and sorrow. His voice was low when he spoke, offering a cruel sort of mercy. Leave now, and he would spare her life. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I belong here," she said, voice firm, "and I'm not afraid." For a long moment, Boone studied her. Memories flickered behind his eyes. A boy once bound by honor, broken by betrayal. The outlaw within him wrestled with a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred by this widow who stood so tall against the desert's cruelty. Returning to his camp, Boone's resolve hardened, but so did his doubt. When one of his men mocked his hesitation, Boone struck him down with a cold fury that shocked even those who knew his temper. His loyalty to the gang wavered, torn between old codes and the strange respect Clara had awakened. Everett, observing from the shadows, finally revealed his purpose to Clara. Once thought dead, he had returned to bring Boone Crowder to justice, not just for the law, but for the personal wrongs that festered in his soul. Clara listened, steady but unyielding, telling Everett she was no damsel to be saved. "I can handle my own battles," she said, the weight of loss and determination in her voice. The night deepened over Red Moon Ridge, the wind carrying whispers of war and reckoning. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, a storm was gathering, a collision of past sins, hidden strength, and a justice born not of law, but of unbreakable will. The first light of dawn spilled pale over Devil's Hollow, a narrow canyon carved deep between jagged cliffs and twisted junipers. The air hung heavy with dust and the scent of dry earth, the silence broken only by the distant call of a hawk. Clara McAllister stood at the edge of the bluff, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. Her hands gripped the worn rifle that had belonged to her husband, steady, unyielding. Every muscle in her body was coiled like a spring, ready for the violence she hoped to avoid but was prepared to unleash. Below, the Crowder gang rode hard, 6 men cutting through the narrow pass like vultures drawn to carrion. Boone Crowder led them, his face a mask of grim determination. Yet beneath that hardened exterior, a flicker of hesitation lingered, a silent acknowledgment of the woman waiting above, the widow who had defied every expectation. Clara's traps lay hidden among the rocks and brush, snares woven from twisted wire, bear traps dug shallow and concealed beneath loose dirt, smoke bombs packed tight with dry sage and saltpeter. Each was a testament to her patient planning and intimate knowledge of the land. The canyon was her ally, and she intended to use every advantage it offered. As the gang entered Devil's Hollow, the first trap snapped shut with a harsh clang. Jed, the youngest of Boone's men, cried out, one leg caught in the cruel steel jaws. Panic rippled through the others, but Clara's rifle cracked sharp through the morning air, a bullet finding its mark in the shoulder of a man who tried to rush forward. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Smoke billowed from a nearby thicket, where Clara had lit her makeshift bombs. Confusion spread among the outlaws as the choking haze clouded their vision and stoked their fear. One by one, they faltered under the relentless pressure, their confidence unraveling in the face of a foe they had underestimated. Boone's eyes locked onto Clara, and in that moment, the outlaw saw not a victim but a storm incarnate. Her gaze was fierce, unyielding, an ember burning through the dust and lies of his world. He realized with a jolt that she had never been a prize to claim or a mark to scare. She was the reckoning itself. Everett Kane moved silently through the brush below, cutting off any escape the gang might seek. His rifle was as steady as Clara's, his presence a ghostly force that tightened the noose. Boone's men faltered, caught between the widow's wrath above and the marshal's unseen hand below. The showdown came swift and merciless. Boone raised his gun, fingers steady despite the chaos. Everett stepped into view, his own weapon leveled. The two men held each other's gaze, old grudges and new understandings flickering between them like lightning. Then Clara stepped forward, placing herself between Boone and Everett. Her voice was calm but unshakable. "This isn't the way," she said, eyes blazing. "Boone's not your enemy, not anymore." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Boone's gun lowered slowly, the fight draining from his posture. He dropped his weapon to the dusty ground, surrendering not just to Everett but to the truth Clara had spoken. Everett's hand trembled as he holstered his rifle, the weight of justice shifting in the desert light. The fight was over, not with bloodshed, but with a quiet understanding forged in the fires of hardship and honor. Devil's Hollow grew still again, the wind whispering through the canyon as if mourning the violence it had witnessed. Clara stood tall, the rifle resting lightly in her hands, a symbol not just of defense, but of the fierce heart that refused to be broken. As the dust settled, the legend of that stand began to take shape, not in gunfire and lawlessness, but in the unyielding courage of a woman who faced down a gang of outlaws and changed the course of their lives forever. The sun dipped low behind Red Moon Ridge, casting a golden haze over the quiet land that had borne witness to the clash in Devil's Hollow. The dust, once thick with the thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of gunfire, now lay heavy on the parched earth, settling slowly as if the desert itself were breathing a long, weary sigh. The violence had passed, but its echoes lingered, and the scars on weathered wood, the stillness of broken silence, and the memory etched deep into the heart of the land. Clara McAllister stood on the porch of her ranch, her eyes tracing the fading light across the distant canyons. The rifle rested against the railing, no longer a weapon of war, but a relic of hard-won peace. Her hands, once steady only in toil and survival, now carried the weight of a story few would believe. A widow who had faced down a gang of outlaws, a woman who had held the line when law had faltered. Beside her, Everett Kane cleaned his rifle with deliberate care, the quiet between them thick but comfortable. The marshal's gruff exterior had softened since the stand at Devil's Hollow, and beneath the dust and danger, a tentative respect had taken root. Clara had not needed saving, and Everett had long ago learned that justice was not always delivered by a badge, but sometimes by the steady hand of those who refused to break. Boone Crowder, once the scourge of the frontier, now sat on the edge of the ranch's small corral, his eyes cast downward. The man who had ridden into Red Moon Ridge with fire in his heart now carried the weight of surrender, not just to the law, but to the unexpected mercy of a woman he had once meant to conquer. The outlaw's hard edges had softened, worn down by the unyielding spirit Clara had shown. He was a man changed, not by chains, but by the undeniable strength of an enemy who had refused to be won. The town around them, small and wary, began to murmur stories, whispers of the widow who had stood alone against the Crowder gang, of the marshal who had come back from the dead, and the outlaw who had laid down his guns. Children dared to dream of heroes born from hardship, and old men nodded in quiet approval, knowing the frontier still held legends worth telling. That night, under a blanket of stars, Clara walked to the edge of the ridge, the cool breeze, carrying the scent of sage and earth. She looked out across the vastness, knowing that the peace they had earned was fragile, always threatened by the harshness of the land and the restless hearts that roamed it. But for now, the story was theirs, a tale of courage, of unexpected alliances, and of a woman who had carved her place in a world that sought to forget her. As the moon rose, Clara whispered a vow to the night, a promise not to let the darkness reclaim what they had fought so hard to protect. The past could not be changed, nor the laws rewritten, but the future, like the shifting sands, was hers to shape. And somewhere in the stillness, the wind carried the first breath of a new legend, one that would live long after the last gunshot faded. A story of justice born not from the barrel of a gun, but from the unbreakable spirit of a woman who refused to be owned by any man. The frontier was watching, waiting for its next tale. But for now, the dust had settled and legends had risen.